Okay. Hello and welcome everyone to Bold Conversations about Equity. Before getting started, we want to go over a few Zoom etiquette rules. So, we ask all participants to please stay on mute throughout the presentation unless called upon. However, we encourage you to use the chat box to ask any questions that we may address later. Since this will be an engaging discussion, we'd like to know who our fellow participants are. So please do update your name. In order to see who is speaking, you can go to speaker view, which you'll find at the top right corner of your Zoom screen. Most importantly, we want everyone to be present, be mindful, and be respectful of this opportunity to engage in important conversations. As we move forward, I'd like to introduce the Chief Programs Officer, Ms. Denise Williams, to get us started. Denise?
Sorry, talking away. Hi, Denise Williams here, Chief Program Officer of the Silicon Valley Ed Foundation. I am very excited to welcome you all to the second session of our initiative, Bold Conversations about Equity, ensuring equitable access for students of color. Topic for this evening is race. What's equity got to do with it? Our initiative purpose is to confront issues of race and equity in society and their impact on education, to ensure access and opportunity that leads to success for students of color, to fulfill our obligation to respond to what is happening now. And our outcomes for our sessions are to shift adult mindset and encourage courageous conversations. So what's happening this evening? We're going to have an awesome panel discussion with a Q&A afterwards. Then we're going to have a breakout group activity where you'll have smaller groups and you'll be able to interact more with your members that are in your group. We will have a debrief when we come back after the breakouts. And then, as usual, we'll have a challenge to action at the end. So 4 agreements of courageous conversations. We always like to review these. These are adapted from Glenn Singleton and Chris Linton's Courageous Conversations about Race, a field guide for achieving equity in schools. Please stay engaged, speak with truth and with respect, experience discomfort. That's okay. There's a lot of times we have these conversations and we walk away from them and you may have a gut feeling about something that's not sitting right with you, but that's okay. You'll experience that on many occasions, and expect and accept non-closure. So now I'd like to tell you just a little bit about this amazing gentleman that's going to moderate the panel. Manny Barbara serves as the advisor to the CEO of Silicon Valley Education Foundation. Previously, he served as the Vice President of Thought Leadership and Advocacy at SVF for 10 years, including a year as the interim CEO. In this capacity, he was responsible for developing SVF's education strategy and advocacy, developing education forums and programs such as Elevate Math. He developed and coordinated the Eastside Alliance, a learning network of 8 school districts serving around 85,000 students, leveraging resources to advance student success. He was also responsible for developing the Spartan Eastside Promise, a partnership with San Jose State University and the Eastside Alliance, allowing students to attend San Jose State University. Prior to SVEF, Manny served as the superintendent in the Oak Grove School District for 10 years. During this time, he led a major initiative addressing issues of race and equity through a systemic approach. The result was an increase in student performance, results for all student subgroups, including accelerating Black and Latinx student performance at grade 8 algebra, The district was awarded the Applied Materials Springboard Schools Award for overall academic achievement of all student subgroups, reflecting successful efforts to close the achievement gap. Additionally, he received the 100 Black Men Educator of the Year Award, the California Alliance of African American Educators Culturally Courageous Leadership Award, AXA Region 8 Superintendent of the Year and Valuing Diversity Awards, the City of San Jose Excellence in Education Award, and the AXA State Robert E. Kelly Award. Boy, Manny, you the man. Awesome. Take it away.
Oh, thank you very much, Denise. And I'd like to welcome everyone to our forum here. This is a very special series, and I'm very proud to be part of it. And I want to commend our CEO, Lisa Andrew, who, along with Denise, who came up with this idea to have this series. So I think it's terrific that we're able to take on this critical issue. I want to say a little bit about the Silicon Valley Education Foundation. You can see our what we do, our vision, our mission. Basically, we want to create a pathway for success in college and career for students, especially those who are underserved. We do it primarily through our signature program, our Elevate math program, under the leadership of our VP, Deb Negretti, who will be facilitating today. And it is an extended, for those who are not familiar with it, it's an extended time math program for students to help accelerate their progress in math. We also do it through our advocacy. Denise is now coordinating the Eastside Alliance. As she mentioned, it is the Eastside High School District and 7 elementary districts serving over 80,000 students. And as part of that, we have a partnership with San Jose State University with the Spartan Eastside Promise, so that students graduating from the Eastside Union High School District have a place at San Jose State if they meet minimum criteria. And with that, we have a partnership with the Eastside Education Foundation, raising scholarship funds for students from Eastside who attend San Jose State through the Promise. So we're very delighted to have you with us here today. We have a great panel that I'd like to introduce to you right now. And I want to thank the panel right off the bat for making yourselves available for this here today. And let me just go and introduce them to you. First, James Otieno, who is a board member and co-founder of PV Tech, also a senior executive, former senior executive at Hewlett-Packard. James, thank you for being with us here this evening. Adora Fisher is the director of the Education Preparation Program at the County Office of Education. Thank you, Adora. It's my pleasure to work with Adora through the LEAD program. We have Edgar Quiroz-Medrano, who's a teacher in the Franklin McKinley School District, who will provide his perspective from the education world. We have 2 people from the political world. Ellen Kamei, who's the vice mayor of the city of Mountain View. Thank you, Ellen, for being with us today. And Kalra, who is the assembly member from District 27. Ash is also a graduate of the Oak Grove School District, Hayes Elementary, and Herman Intermediate School. So we'd like to take credit for Ash. So thank you for being with us here today. And then we have Hannah Gordon, who's the Chief Administrative Officer, General Counsel from the San Francisco 49ers. And we have a very strong partnership with the 49ers through the STEM Leadership Institute at Santa Clara Unified. And I want to thank Hannah and the 49ers for their tremendous support and partnership with SVEF. So let's just get started. And we're going to get involved in a discussion here on an issue that, again, we don't want to come up with a definition for everyone. We're going to create our own definition today of what race and what equity is. What is equity? It's a word that's bantered about quite a bit. But what does it mean? And so I'd like to start off with you, Adora. What does the word equity mean to you, and how has the definition manifested itself in your life?
Thank you, Manny, for having me, and I appreciate being part of this prestigious panel. I have done a lot of work in equity in my sphere of influence. And that's the way that I've always looked at equity. And I spent a lot of time coming up with different definitions based upon the organization I was in at the time. And so recently, I have to say, I just went to Merriam-Webster. And I said, what is their definition, right? And so in looking that up, Webster's definition is justice according to the law. And it also says that it's a right. And it continues to talk about a legal aspect of equity in that it's a body of legal doctrines. And its purpose is to enlarge and supplement and sometimes override a narrow system of rigid law. And so when I looked that up, and I did that over the summer as we were going through so much angst around equity and justice, and I realized that for me, equity is an action word. At one point in my life, it was very symbolic, and then at another point in my life, it became very much about action. I grew up during affirmative action. I saw the death of Martin Luther King Jr. I have been through a lot of marches and Black Panther activities growing up in the city of Chicago. And so I've always been surrounded by this concept or this strive for equity. And now at this point in my life, it's really about what are you doing? What are you doing to serve justice? What are you doing to change inequities? The word equity exists because there is inequities. The word justice exists because there's injustice. So I have to say that for me, at this point in my life and my career, it's about doing. It's a doing word, and it's about changing inequities and changing injustices, and not just on a larger scale in terms of law, but in terms of the sphere that I influence.
So the key word, obviously, what I'm hearing here, it's not just to talking about it, but what are we going to do about it? The action component.
Exactly.
How about some of the others on the panel? Thank you, Adora. That's a good way to kind of get us started. Others on the panel that like to weigh in?
Sure, Manny, I'll weigh in. This is James. I'll weigh in. The term equity to me is a bit confusing, particularly coming from the corporate world. As you mentioned, I was the senior vice president at Hewlett-Packard, and one of my functions was to manage the equity program. And in the corporate world, the equity program has nothing to do with fairness. It's more about stock incentives, and so on. So for most people that I spoke with in the corporate world, when I use the term equity, they were assuming I was talking about stock incentives. Okay. And so if we wanted to talk about fairness and justice and things of that nature, they would refer to that as diversity and inclusion. And that's and particularly in the environment that we're in right now in the corporate world, that term equity gets confused. And I did, just as Adora did, I did look up what the definition of equity is, but I did not go to Webster. I went to the NEKC Foundation because they do a lot of work on equity and equality on racial justice. So I looked at their definition, and their definition is very similar to what Adora said. They said equity defined as the state, quality, or ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. And they say that their process is about systemic equity, which is a complex combination of interrelated elements consciously designed to create, support, and sustain social justice. And I actually do believe in that, because to me, when I think about equity, I think about fairness and I think about social justice. And one of the things that has brought a lot of this to light, I think we can thank the pandemic, for focusing us on the various social injustices that exist, particularly among toward the people of color. The George Floyd situation, for the murder of George Floyd. And if we were going about our daily business as we normally do in a non-pandemic world, I don't think we'd have had the same focus. So I look forward to continue to work on the active part of making equity available to all.
Yeah, James, you bring up a good point. It's kind of interesting that it took something like the COVID situation to raise some inequities, which anyone that's been involved, it's been around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Just all of a sudden is brought to the focus. And you also bring up something really important, that words matter. Mm-hmm. We throw the word around in education all the time, but it may mean something completely different outside. And I'm going to come back to something here. I don't want to get too political, but I do want to throw this out, and then I want to hear from the rest of the panel. But my experience has been everyone's in favor of equity till it starts to impact them. And Adora, you mentioned affirmative action, and I can't help but notice that in a state that is very blue, that went overwhelmingly, for the Democratic candidate, Proposition 15 did not pass, which I thought might be an opportunity to do something about equity. So I'll throw that out there, and maybe we'll be able to come back to it later on if we have some time. Someone else on the panel, what does equity mean to you?
Manny, I'm happy to jump in. I think that we just heard some great comments to set the stage. And the reality is that those definitions make it quite clear. And I think you made mention of this about the inequities that we're seeing due to COVID. The reality is that COVID is not creating inequities, it's exposing inequities that have been around for a very, very long time. It's making them much more apparent, much more clear, much more stark. And you can see it quite clearly with the stock market getting record highs and yet thousands of people in food lines. And so the definitions that were put forth in equity, of what equity means, the reality is we are falling far, far short of meeting equity in a real tangible sense, especially given the fact that our laws that should be the standard bearer for equity have been inequitable since the inception of this nation. And we're still are we just still grappling with that? We have a long way to go to create a truly equitable society. Because even if on paper, we can, obviously the civil rights movement and the extraordinary legal rights that have been attained, whether it's with civil rights movement, in more recent years, the LGBT rights. So it's one thing to say on paper, okay, we are now equal. It's another when you consider systemic racism and systemic prejudices that have existed through centuries. It's another to actually create a society that is just and equitable. And I think that's what we are all grappling with, is the realization. Some still are in denial, some don't want to realize it, some say that they're colorblind, whatever they want to say. But I think many of us and many in our society, as evidenced by millions marching in the streets, as evidenced by this new dialogue that we're all having, want to at least try to come to terms with this journey towards a more perfect union, which includes creating that equitable society that I hope that we all can share, at least in having as a goal.
I think you bring up an excellent point that, like, the COVID is just simply exposing the inequities that are already there. And I think also a point that, equal doesn't mean the same as equity. Equity means how do we get everyone up to a certain level? And I think you bring up a really good point that maybe at least it will begin the dialogue. At least it appears to have started in our society. At least it's in everyone's mind. So at least we can begin the discussion. And thank you for that, Ash. Edgar, I'm gonna jump to you, and only in the sense, not only, but because Ash brought up like exposing the inequities, and you see this a lot in the schools, right? With going on right now with the students who might be hurt with the distance learning and so forth. But so what does equity mean to you? And, you know, how have you seen it manifested right now?
So I was trying to jump in before, but my headphones weren't working. For me, equity, it's a loaded question. My background is in social justice activism. From 92 to about 2009, I was an undocumented immigrant, and between 2006 and 2009 were really tumultuous times in our country. And so there was a lot of animosity towards the undocumented population within the United States with HR 4437, I think is what it was. And that's where I got my start in what is now would be considered equity work. And so for me, equity means social justice. Equity means justice. Equity means that my kindergartners are seen as fully realized human beings as soon as they walk in through the door. Equity for me means that the school that I'm currently at is as funded fully as any school, any privileged neighborhood or community within our county. Because I had the privilege of working in one of the most, in a very affluent community in San Jose, and now I'm working in the Seven Trees neighborhood, and the differences were very stark. In the privileged community, I had a budget of $1,600 for the entire year that I was able to use at my discretion. Something that I haven't seen where I'm at right now. And so for me, equity means social justice. It also means access for our students to engage in experiences that they might otherwise not have. As an educator, something that I hear consistently is that there's this education gap. And I don't believe the education gap exists. What really exists is an opportunity gap. There's a lack of opportunities for our children of color that are lacking in some of the neighborhoods that I serve, and that's not the case for some of the more privileged neighborhoods. So for me, it's definitely access and funds. Because if we really want to close this achievement gap, we need to be able to expose the youngest of learners to museums, to parks, to the arts, and not just your European canon, but artists of color, painters of color, museums where they're predominantly showing the images of the kids that are sitting at not sitting at our desks right now, but that are virtually staring back at me through Zoom. You know, we have to be able to create these spaces for them. And for me, that's what equity looks like. Equity is creating the space where our children of color can live their authentic selves in a place where they're not being judged, in a place where we are nurturing them, in a place where we are loving them. Because as a person of color going through the education system, there were many different points in my career where I could have fallen through the cracks, but I had an amazing support through my family. But I also had teachers that believed in me. And I think giving our kids those resources, and above all else, listening to them. Because as educators, it's easy for us to impose our thought process behind our thoughts into our classrooms. But at the end of the day, we need to listen to them. If not, we're being educational colonizers and we're imposing our will on them. And ultimately, that's not what we want for our children. We want them to thrive and exist as their full human self.
You know, Edgar, you bring up appropriately the difference in the opportunity gap and the difference in resources. You don't work in a wealthy community, and you're not at a wealthy school. So we'll come back to that. We'll talk about education, but you said something that I think resonated with me from a personal basis. The idea of not judging. And I get the feeling that you experienced that in your, going through that sense of judgment, and the idea of providing that kind of environment for your students is really important to you. Yeah,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's when we talk about the injustices and how that this country has committed against the most vulnerable populations, against populations of color, against the indigenous people that were here, and the enslavement of Black folk. It's easy for an it's when we want to go back and address these issues, we're always looking towards education, and it's important that as we move forward, we allow our students to be themselves, because for such a long time they've been told no, no, no in multiple different ways, in the curriculum that we have, in the books that we read to them, in the way that we present information. I mean, right now we're getting close to Thanksgiving, and I'm sure there are teachers out there that are still dressing up their kids in Native American and Pilgrims. And that's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. And so that's not letting them be their authentic self.
Yeah.
And so we need to be able to hold space for them, because ultimately what we want for our children, we want for ourselves. What we want for our children is what we want for ourselves. And we want to be heard, we want to be listened, and our kids want to be heard, and our kids want to be listened.
Thank you, Edgar. And before we go to Ellen and Hannah, I would just like to remind everyone, you have a chat function there. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, or you just want to make a comment, that function is there for you. And please avail yourself of that opportunity. At the end of the panel discussion, we will go through and review some of those questions. So Ellen and Hannah,
Sure.
would you like to go ahead? Ellen?
Yes, thanks so much, Manny. I think that, one of the things I've been reflecting on as the question has gone on with my fellow panelists is just thinking about how somehow equity has just been built into the system, right? And so for me, equity is freedom from the biases and the prejudices that come with this kind of built-in system that our society and our country has had. And on a personal level, I think that equity for me is the ability to tell my own story and not have others tell that story for me. And what I think is, often I think when you are a person of color, somebody kind of tells your story based on what you look like visually or how you speak. And I think that already kind of puts those biases up about where you come from or your background or the type of education that you had. But for me, as somebody who grew up multiracial, I think in terms of how equity played into the system, there was never a box that I could check that was for me. I always had to check the other box. And when you are a young person growing up, I think particularly as a person of color, and you're constantly checking another box, even up into when I had to for my college applications, I think that sticks with you. And that kind of puts you into an inequitable, playing field, which is, I think, at least in my role in city government, what I'm trying to do is change things from the inside out, right? Because that's where we're going to see the systemic change to these inequities. So I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you.
So Ellen, you bring up an interesting point. Your point is that these inequities are already built in the system. It's not like something that's external. You grew up experiencing it, and kind of like what I just heard Edgar say about listening to the students, it's that listening to the counter story of, rather than people making that defining you, listening to your story, which is what we're hopefully doing today, but that you have to overcome a lot of internal systemic bias. And we're going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to that systemic bias before we finish here, because I'd like to hear some further discussion on that. So thank you for bringing up that particular point. Hannah?
Yeah, so coming from a background of sports and of law, I think of equity as meritocracy. Are we all starting the race from the same line? And in terms of the law, as other panelists have brought up, it's about equal justice under the law. Are we all being treated the same? Are we all getting the same opportunities? And I think our struggle as a country, as a people, is that the ideal of what America is, the ideal of our democracy is so beautiful, and the reality of it is so far from our ideal. And so there is a disconnect then further, especially for white people and white Americans who want to believe that the reality and the ideal are much more merged than they are. And so it's coming to grips with the facts versus what we want to be, and accepting that just because we've fallen short as human beings of our ideals doesn't mean that our ideals are wrong, right? It doesn't mean that we should give up on America. It means it's okay to criticize ourselves. And in fact, in sports, that's exactly how you get better, right? You watch the film, you're incredibly self-critical. And if you truly love the game, then that's what you do. If you want to be the best, that's what you do. And I think that's what we have to do now, is say, we want to be the best. We want to be as close to our ideals as possible. So we need to take a really hard look in the mirror and start fixing the problems that we have that are very real.
You brought up something interesting. You know, we always talk about the education achievement gap. And so you brought up the gap between the idea versus the ideal, and how different it is for different groups of people, and the importance of, you know, at the very least, acknowledging the facts that are there as a very, very first start, which even that sometimes is more difficult to accomplish with that. Let me throw this out and to whoever would like to get started, because we've heard a couple of things about systemic social justice. Hannah, you've just brought up social justice again. What does social justice look like in as a beginning way to address the systemic racism that we have in our society, or the systemic inequities? It may come from your perspective as a law, Hannah, or someone else from education or corporate work, but what does social justice look like if we want to do something about addressing the inequities within the system?
Manny, I'd like to jump in here and prior to addressing the social justice question, I'd like to build on something Edgar said, and actually Ellen brought up as well. And that's individual stories, right? And I think as a nation, as a country, my individual story is an American story. My heritage is an American heritage. America has to own my heritage. I can trace my heritage back to the slave owners that my ancestors worked for. And it's an American heritage. And we often talk about the inequities in this country as if someone else did them and we don't own them. And so in order to talk about justice and injustice, and to talk about equity and inequity, you have to own everybody's story, because it's an American story. And it's not either, in my opinion, you don't want to judge it as good as bad or bad. It is what it is. And then we own that, and then we determine how we deal with this experiment we call democracy in a just manner. How do we look at it from all aspects, legal, social, and when we talk about educational, every system in this country we must own, and every story we must own. And we must look at the systems we've created and the stories that are in those systems, and then tear down the inequitable and the injustice structures we've built. But until we own everyone's story and stop talking about it like it's somebody else's story, I don't know how we get to that ideal place, how we move to that ideal place. I just want
to respond or comment to that. Comments on that?
I'll respond. Something that sticks out with the dismantling part, and something that sticks out that I reflect on, and it came from you, Manny, during one of the classes, I forgot which one, last year during LEAP, was that when in the transition of power, someone's always going to lose something. And I think that's one of the big reasons why I agree with what Adora said, that we need to own these stories, but to own these stories means that we're going to own the legacy that was left behind. And for a lot of people, that might not be it might not be the best taste, right? And for them, because they're going to be losing systemic power. They're going to be losing whatever position they have on this, racist ladder that was created. And so owning the stories is important, but it's going to be one of the biggest challenges because people are going to be losing power. People are going to be losing the privileges that they had and that they believe that they had that made them feel secure in whatever position in society they might have. And so owning the stories is important, but we also have to realize that in that transition, in that dismantling of these systematic racist institutions, that those powers are going to be lost, and some people are not going to be willing to budge from it, and they're going to stick to what they've known. And that's where one of the biggest challenges is going to come from. Is going to come from the individuals that, are saying, this is who we are, this is who we are, this is what we've always been about, without truly understanding the history behind it. And it's a matter of how do we bring those individuals into the fold? Because we're going to need everyone on board in order to be able to dismantle these systems, in order to give justice to our children and to give justice to our communities. Because for such a long time, in whatever aspect we've all served, we've seen these injustices, either by being the speaker for your community, or by the nuanced comments that someone throws at you, like, oh, you're so articulate, oh, like, this has happened in the Latinx community, and then all eyes shift on you. And so it's a matter of story sharing. And one thing that I remember as well is that in the class I kept saying that I'm not here to navigate white people's feelings, but one thing that you pointed out is that in order for this work to be done, it needs to happen. And so my question is, how do we go about incorporating these individuals that are very resistant to this change? Because we need this change. The 2020 has been one tumultuous year, and the summer has taught us that there are individuals, a good chunk of individuals are ready for this change, but then we still have we have 70 million that still want to stick to the old ways. And so how do we incorporate them into this work? And that's the difficult part, because oftentimes they're not going to want to move, but the stories are important. We have to share them, and we have to acknowledge them if we are going to move forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Edgar, I loved what you said. And the one piece that I know I struggle with is how do we shift that narrative from someone's going to lose power to this is actually going to liberate everyone, and that moving into an actually equitable society is going to increase our GDP, is going to improve things for all people. I think I worry that I think the white supremacist sort of patriarchal structure is actually built on this whole concept of fear and a zero-sum game. And if you can break down the idea that the world is zero-sum, then it doesn't become scary for other people to have power, because it doesn't mean that I'm losing power. And I think that when we talk about, 70 million people who have been seeing things a different way, it's because people have played to their fear and have told them someone else gaining something, someone else coming to this country is going to cost you, it's going to hurt you, you are losing out. And so I think, and I don't know how we do this, and I've been trying to figure it out for years, so I'm open to everybody's thoughts and ideas and excited to hear them, but it's how do we change that narrative so that people truly see equity as something that improves things for their own children, right? That when someone else's child is in a school that is underfunded, someday that is actually going to hurt your child too. That the society we are raising your child into is going to be a society that has strife and conflict, and that has so much, pain, whatever it is, crime, etc., whatever speaks to them. Because if we are only concerned with our own children and the children in our own school and in our own little segregated neighborhood, we can never move outside of that.
Well, let's just go there, because I think you bring up the issue following up on Edgar's point, that we're really talking about reframing this whole issue of power, right? So let me just bring that up. I mean, and again, feel free, panel, jump in on the social justice systemic issue, but let me just bring up like Proposition 15. Let me just go there with that. There was an opportunity in this state to address affirmative action. This is a very blue liberal, but it failed. What am I missing there? What happened? Here was a chance to do something. I have in my neighborhood, I have Black Lives Matter, post signs all over the place, but didn't pass. What, am I missing something there, or am I?
I don't know, Manny. We may be missing something. I know with respect to that proposition, if you drove around Saratoga, Cupertino, places like Woodside, Atherton, there are a lot of no signs on the lawn.
Mm-hmm.
And if you drove around East Palo Alto, some parts of San Jose, around Alum Rock, there were a lot of yes signs on the lawn, which speaks to this racial inequality and the social justice inequality. I don't think, just going back to that, I don't think that one, I don't have an answer, because I don't know, I don't have an answer to how to address the problem. But to Edgar's point and to Hannah's point, and also to Adora's point about the stories, it is important to have the stories. It is important to try and figure out a way of how to change the narrative. I don't know if we'll be able to get there, but I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that future generations will be able to get there. And I think, because I see, as the world is getting smaller, the internet has, the whole system has changed, and the world is getting smaller. And I believe that technology is going to help us to some way, somewhere down the road, achieve a little bit more, make a little bit more progress on racial justice and also social justice, because that's the way I think that we can get to equity. I mean, I tell this story. I used to tell the story, and I still do at times. Back in my corporate life, I would talk on the phone with a bunch of folks from different places, and they'd listen to me, and they'd hear me, and they'd be surprised when we actually met face to face. They said, "You don't sound black."
Mm.
That's a very common refrain. You don't sound black. And I said, "What does black sound like?" And so, and there are all these built-in internal biases that we as a people have that it's going to take some time to get rid of. And I think future generations might have a better crack at it.
And
if I could
good.
as well, and I appreciate James for that perspective. And I think that there's a couple of many different things are going on. That there was an impression by many that somehow Prop 15 was creating disparities or creating distinctions, as opposed to the goal of actually creating opportunity for all. Because if you look at some of the polling, it only passed in 3 out of the 58 counties in our state. And even in the Latino community, it didn't necessarily poll that well. And so I think there was definitely a perception and education piece to what it actually did, because it was a reaction to a very racist proposition from 25 years ago that was specifically designed to create division.
Right.
But I think part of it is, this was mentioned earlier, that everyone's for, people will march Black Lives Matter, and they'll be, at the Cesar Chavez March, and they'll be for, women's equal pay until something affects them. And if people feel that it's affecting them, then, and I think that's a problem. I think there's been this selfishness that's been created over in our society. And I hope that we can use technology and other things to help to combat it. But I think technology has helped to foster that kind of sense of quote independence and separation from others, where we don't see each other. I mean, here we are in the capital of Silicon Valley, one of the wealthiest places on earth, and yet we have extreme poverty. The 3 zip codes in the Bay Area with the highest infection and death rates of COVID are in my assembly district in East San Jose. Those are the people that are working, that allow us to stay at home, that allow people to work at home, that allow people to teach their kids at home. And yet, as recently we had an education committee hearing based upon the digital divide and inequities. And here in the capital of Silicon Valley, we have far too many kids that aren't even connected, and whose parents have to go to work because they're deemed essential, but they're treated as if they're sacrificial because they don't get sick days. They don't have the same access to healthcare. And so we're saying, we'll give them a pat on the back. Oh, thank you for working. And at the end of the day, they're the ones that are dying from COVID, and their kids are the ones that are falling behind. And so it's much easier to have the conversation, and and as Adora led us off with, it's much easier to talk than to have the action. And the question is, what are we willing to do that may actually mean that we have to personally sacrifice something to make sure our neighbor's okay, that our neighbor's doing okay? What do we have to do to make sure that everyone that surrounds us is being taken care of? Because right now we're not doing a very good job of it, but I think that there's enough of us that have the positive and good intentions that we can make that happen. And I think the folks that are on this panel do. I got to say that, I'm very, to hear someone like Edgar is teaching our children is a beautiful thing, that we have someone that actually has these values, and that we have folks here that are in the corporate world, that are in the education space, that believe in the same thing, but what are we willing to do in terms of taking real concrete action that, yes, may mean someone's taxes go up. Yes, it may mean that you have to put a woman on your board of directors or a person of color on your board of directors if you're not already willing to do so, and on and on and on.
So, Ash, one of the things that we when we talk about losing and losing power, people are going to lose much more than that. We've got, I did some research a couple years ago. There were 1.7 million students that took the CASP test, right? 1.3 of them were Hispanic students. 35% of them did not meet standard. And that was only in 3rd through 5th grade, 6th grade, and middle school and junior high school. That did not count any students not in those grade levels. Those students are going to be the ones that we're counting on for retirement, for Medicare, for Social Security, to make sure our roads are smooth, to make sure bridges are built, that make sure our infrastructure works. People don't understand what's at stake when these children are not successful, because they haven't experienced it yet. But that's our majority population. So they will experience it. And if we don't start pointing out that reality, they worry about power, but they're not worrying about the day-to-day loss. And they are now experiencing standing in those food lines. Mm-hmm. And that's going to become much more common if those children do not become successful, because someone's going to pay.
Because it's having effect throughout the system is kind of your point. I want to point out that we have a little over 6 minutes to go. So for the panel, just to kind of summarize, then we have some questions on the chat room, but any final comments in terms of what can we do to address these things from a systemic basis? I mean, it does require sometimes giving up. I remember years ago, the county superintendent was trying to get a county parcel tax passed. And it was going along real well until I was on a subcommittee with a group of people from Palo Alto. The parcel tax was going to be $99 across the county. And the people at the table said, why should we agree to this? We could pass one our own for 5 times as much and we get it all. And that's exactly what happened. So how do we address this? Any ideas, any final closing statements from the panel of action items that can be taken? I heard about raising taxes and so on, but what would you do if you could just wave a magic wand?
I would shift funds from one of the biggest percentages that take away public funds and fund it into our education system. Right now, I mean, our military budget is exceptionally large, but when in comparison to our education budget, I mean, as teachers, sometimes we're scrounging for basic necessities. And I think one of the things that we need to be able to do is, as a nation, we need to examine what we value the most. And if we value children, if we value life, we need to be able to make sure that these institutions that serve our children are fully funded.
Right.
And that is what's going to ensure our democracy. That is what's going to ensure our economy, is by providing these funds for our schools, especially our most needed schools, not just in Silicon Valley, but in Flint, not just in California, but also in Detroit, and making sure that every school that is underfunded receives their full share and more.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, bottom line is, the poorest funded schools are the ones with the students who have the least amount of resources. That's a reality. That's a fact. That's indisputable. And whether you're in the east side of San Jose, or whether you're in Detroit or any other part of the country, that's been there. So that would be one thing. Great. Anyone else? Thank you, Edgar.
Oh, I just want to jump in, which is, you know,
Is that Ellen, or is it?
oh, is it, can you hear me?
No, we can. There we go.
Okay. So I was just trying to say, I think it's really clear in terms of what equity isn't. And we all know that feeling of, we've all probably experienced it, and we know that. And in terms of, I think, bringing it to action, you know, I think we have to think about what's lost when we do not prioritize equity. So, you know, I think that, just to give an example of what I've tried to do, and I always feel inspired by Assemblymember Kalra, which is like, you know, you have to do something about it, right? You can't just say you're about it, you have to really be about it. And so for the city, we created an ad hoc subcommittee on race, equity, and inclusion. And we're really trying to figure out where our numbers are in diversity, with gender. We are looking at engaging the public on our budget, because we have had them talk to us about, how are you prioritizing, you know, our communities of color and those who most need funding. And we want to, you know, instead of kind of shielding that information, we want their input. We want them to feel more engaged and involved and be part of the story. So I think it's really about kind of making it a priority. The 3 council members of color are on this subcommittee. And I think part of it is, you know, bringing that understanding of the daily microaggressions that happen, and being able to bring that into real policy and changing systems. So just wanted to.
Thank you for that. That's a very specific thing that you're doing. Thank you. Rest of the panel, any comment on this that you want to weigh in before we go to the questions?
I think too, Manny, in terms of education, we have to educate our administrators and our teachers about systems and equity, and how to find, or how to identify barriers to curriculum, barriers to services, in their systems at the school level. You can't ask someone to do something about something that they don't know how to see or understand. It's like telling a child to go to a room and get my, I don't know, electric razor, when they don't know what an electric razor is.
Right.
Right? So to tell an administrator, you've got to do something about equity in the system, and they don't know how to find inequity in a system. And so we're trying really hard in our programs at Santa Clara County Office of Ed to embed that in our curriculum. And actually Manny's working really hard with us to make that happen, so that our administrators leave knowing what the system is, first of all, and how to find inequities, and then how to fix them.
Well, Adora, and you've made that as a priority in your leadership. So that's an action that you have taken. Thank you. Rest of the panel, any comments before we go to questions on this? All right. Thank you. So we're going to move. There's some questions here, and I'm just going to no offense to the people that asked the question, I'm just going to review them here. And here's one, and it looks like maybe it goes to Edgar, but anyone could respond. How do you teach from a place of equity? What is that platform? I think it could be a good thing. I'm just not clear if that means we teach that colonization is bad or that it is simply an historic fact and allows students to decide for themselves.
So it's teaching critical thinking skills. It's presenting our students with the facts and giving them the ability to think, process, and analyze the history that the United States has created, or the history that we're fed, right? That we're informed with. And so it's teaching a set of skills that allows students to be critical in their process, that allows them to be thoughtful in their analysis, and it allows them to create their own opinions. Because part of equity also means that our students create and form their own opinions, and they're gonna be different than our own. And that's gonna be expected. And so it's just providing the skill sets that they need in order to be able to process the information and analyze it in a way that allows them to think critically of what's been taught. And that's something that even at kindergarten, I try to do. And I've done it with my kids, where we've had discussions about the civil rights movement and the 1963 Children's Crusades. And some of the best conversations I've had have been with 5-year-olds around social justice and what do we do and how does that look like? And for them, they put it in the simplest terms. Freedom is love. And that's one of the posters, because we made little protest signs. That's one of the protest signs that one of my students made, was that freedom is love. And so we have to ground ourselves in love and be able to do that work, but give the skill sets needed in order to actually allow them to be able to process on their own.
Any other comments from anyone? Thank you, Edgar. So here's a question here from Charles. How do we move from the academic exercise to our current realities? 65 years ago, I was informed that my life was viewed as less valuable than that of a white life. Today, I see that continuing. I don't believe that the pandemic suddenly created that realization. What now to create and promote that value? I am a man. So just kind of, Ash, you kind of made the comment that the COVID just simply exposed things. And what I'm kind of hearing in this question is, 65 years ago, this individual was informed his life was less valuable. And here we are again, 65 years later, we're having this conversation.
I think that, and others have referred to the fact that, we have this sense of American exceptionalism that is just not true in terms of our ideals. Like what we want to aspire to be is something that is remarkable, but what we are and have been is not. And I think that, teaching our real history and who we are is critically important, and not just who we were, but who we are. And Adora and others mentioned that. I think it's critically important. Look, I just had a hearing yesterday, the day before, actually, the info hearing of the Labor Committee. And I basically had workers across the spectrum speak as to what they're experiencing due to COVID. And the reality is that similar to I am a man, those are sanitation workers in the South that, in Memphis, that were not being seen. And that's why they were holding a sign that said, I am a man. I am your equal. Similarly, right now, we have the same thing happening, whether it's a situation where we see, the torture and murder of George Floyd, simply wanting to live, wanting to breathe. Holding a man, he's a man. He's a human being.
High standards, just simply wanting to breathe.
Yeah, and we have workers right now that are getting COVID and so I guess when we think about, it's all kind of connected, right? When it comes to racial justice, economic justice, equity, and those that want to stop progress are those that benefit from the status quo. And once we recognize that and we say, you know what, the status quo is not okay with me. And that's actually something beautiful about this year in the racial justice movement, is that you're seeing a broad spectrum of folks that are out marching. Maybe they don't have the answer. Maybe they don't even know why they're marching. They just know that something isn't right. And so I also, with Charles' comment, I absolutely understand the fatigue that exists, that not as much as we've changed, not much has changed at all.
Yeah.
And it's up to us to decide, do we want our children and our grandchildren 50, 60, 70 years from now fighting for the same things that we're fighting for now? And that's something that we have to decide. Maybe ultimately the political will or the people don't want to change enough. They're satisfied enough. I hope that's not the case.
Well, there's a comment here that Nancy mentioned here talking about the issue of power, right? And how do you get people, which is the real issue, that power has a social responsibility. She uses a Danish word that I don't know if I could pronounce it, samfundssind, or the sense of community spirit, which is a real thing, though. How do we convince I'll just lay it out there, and not to pick on the Palo Altos and the Saratogas, to see that until that the schools in the East Side are funded equally, we're not going to have equity, no matter how many signs we put outside and so forth, that it does become down to power. And Nicodemus has a question here. This is something that's recently happened from a policy perspective. What's the role of ethnic studies in dismantling white supremacy and ensuring equity in education? Anyone have a comment on that? That the state is requiring now at the university level, the state, I think it's a CSU, I don't know, the UC as well, but of course in ethnic studies. Does that have a role in challenging white supremacy and ensuring equity? Any comments by anyone?
I can speak to the first part of the question, and then I'm
Sure.
obviously not an educator, but as somebody
That's
who
fine.
graduated from UC and took different ethnic studies classes, and as a white person, I'll speak to personal experience. But on the first part of it, I do think some of this is a marketing and messaging challenge that we have. I think that as I'll speak for myself, as a liberal, as a person on the left, I see that sometimes though we have the moral right, we have lost the battle in the advertising side of this. And so when we are speaking to people who have privilege, who have power, we have to understand what is motivating them. How do I get to, essentially, I look at this almost like a business problem, right? Because I know where I need to get them to, but I have to figure out how to get them there because for some reason they're not seeing it, even though it's the right thing to do. So I think that's part of it. And then to the second question around ethnic studies, I will say as a white person, I think it's really important that we learn the real history, because if we read books in second grade that tell us that Thanksgiving was this wonderful time where some people came over on a boat and they met some other people and then everybody got along, and there were pilgrims and there were Native Americans and they all had turkey and everything was great, and here we are today. Well, then we don't understand anything about what's going on today. Then we say, oh, I don't understand why some people are not doing as well and getting COVID more than other people. Didn't everyone have the same experience? So I do think that what we teach children, both children of color and white children, is really important for both of their understanding of who they are and what our country is.
Hey, Hannah, what you're bringing up, so let's not wait till college before you get ethnic studies.
Yeah.
That really ought to get started right away because there's a lot of that misinformation and a different narrative that gets started right from the very beginning with that. So thank you for that. Here's a question. Go ahead, James. Sorry.
Yeah, can I just add to what Edgar was talking about, and to some extent what Anna just said? In addition to that critical thinking that Edgar talked about that needs to be taught, I also believe that teaching empathy at a very young age is very important, because I think what we see happening right now, a lot of people don't have the empathy. If I haven't walked in your shoes, or don't think that your shoes are and don't think that I know what your experience is, then I won't be able to identify with you. So teaching that empathy, I think, is very important.
Let me ask you this at the corporate level, and this goes to you and Hannah real quickly as a follow-up, and I want to get to this next question when you talk about empathy, but it's entirely possible in this segregated society, and we are more segregated today than we were when Brown versus Board of Education was passed. And just look at Santa Clara County. It's possible to go through school and never have a conversation with a person of color. It's really possible to do that.
Yes.
How does that happen then when they get into the workplace?
Because it's also possible to be in the workplace, particularly if you're in the upper echelon, and never meet a person of color.
And still, right?
And
I mean,
still.
is it fair to say, James, that you were the exception than the rule to be at the senior level that you achieved?
For a company as large at the time as Hewlett Packard, I would say yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I could count in one hand the number of Black individuals that were directors and above, not just in the US, but throughout the world.
Throughout the world. Okay.
Throughout the world.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a question here from Luis. What kind of literacy and experience would the panel deem as critical to lead equity work effectively? Anyone have an opinion on this? What kind of literacy experience? Maybe it'd be like, what might we read, or maybe an experience that we might have that might expand. I mean, I know if you go through, a program that Edgar went through, or Adora, you would go through a lot, but for the average person out there, where would you want to start? I know there's a lot of books out there now, but
So
I would like to just jump in on that in a way, and build on what Hannah was saying and Edgar in terms of diversifying. You also have to diversify curriculum. You have to diversify the message based upon your audience. Educators are not marketing gurus, but we really need to learn some strategies around messaging. And in education, I've worked both in high socioeconomic districts and low socioeconomic districts. I started my career in the inner city of Chicago. And you've got to diversify the message, because the upper echelon, so to speak, has experiences that other folks don't have. And so their message needs to be different. The same is true of their curriculum in schools. We should be teaching in our lower socioeconomic districts, teaching our children about economics. We should be teaching them about money. We should be teaching them about how to create wealth. And our lower socioeconomic students leave school without that knowledge. Our higher socioeconomic students learn that in school. Learn that at home.
Home, yeah.
And so when they leave, they know what stocks are because they've got some. And they understand the economies of scale, and they understand economic issues. And they are the ones who vote because they understand how politics changes that. But we don't teach that in our inner city schools. So we don't diversify our message, and we don't diversify our curriculum based on the needs of the people that are sitting in front of us. And we've got to begin to think to do that. The curriculum should not be the same for everyone.
So
I learned
adaptive. Yeah.
I learned at home about slavery because that was my heritage. No one needed to teach me that.
Yeah.
But I didn't learn at home about the stock market. That was not a conversation that took place around my dinner table.
So you're bringing out the importance of like an adaptive curriculum. It's not one size fits all with that. So I have a question. We got just a little bit time, but I want to get to this question here. It's pretty complicated one, as often happens when you're running out of time. But I had a student a couple of years ago, this is from Chris, who was firmly entrenched in stances from home. In this discussion, he was hugely pro-wall. I'm assuming they're talking about the wall at the border. His problem related to race versus illegal immigration, or the undocumented. He heard other facts' opinions, but he was not open to taking those ideas into consideration. Any thoughts on how to teach kids like this? So you have students coming in, if I'm hearing this question correctly, they have certain biases. Several, you mentioned the implicit biases that are there in society. They come into that. How do you address that?
So my experience is only with kindergartners. And so the way that I go about doing this is by by reading them stories that they can relate to, or reading them stories that they have some type of attachment to. And we're talking about feelings, we're talking about how, like, using descriptive words that describe emotions, because I was reading one of the comments, someone said that we're often told to deny our emotions. And so at least in my classroom, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to let them, again, be their authentic selves. That includes the emotions. And so the way that I approach the way that I approach students is by giving them these perspectives, giving them these stories. Because I agree with Adora that we have to adapt our curriculum to meet the needs of our students. One of my favorite lines that I will always say until the day that I die, until my career is, until I'm retired, is, I teach children, not curriculum. And so we have to be able to adapt need to be able to adapt our classroom to the needs of our students. And if that involves means having a student that is very pro-wall, is kind of, reiterating these statements that at least for me, I sometimes find very cringeworthy. It's trying to meet them at their level, trying to meet them at where they're at, and saying, okay, so where is this coming from? How entrenched is it? And then how can I present this different perspective to them that they can relate to? Because ultimately at the end, the way that we're going to be breaking down a lot of these barriers is by allowing experiences to come through and allowing them to meet them where they're at, in order for them to be able to attach themselves to that story, to attach themselves to whatever information is being presented, and then think critically. Often it needs to start from kindergarten and move on our way up. But unfortunately, the way that our educational system is set up right now, it doesn't allow for that to happen. Because you have, publishing companies that want to sell these big box curriculums that is one size fits all, but it doesn't meet the needs of all of our students. So again, it's meeting them where they're at, and then moving forward from there.
Thank you, Edgar. So we're going to move to the groups right now. There's a couple of questions that maybe you could discuss within your small groups. One from Emily: how can we approach people who are actively opposed to integration and are outright supporters of white supremacy? And then from Charles, suggests that we promote a value system that includes my experience, church, early child, in other words, their own integration, not assimilation. And then one from Will: our educational system is doing just what it was designed to do. It promotes inequities. We need a reboot in how and what we teach. I think that's a good summary right there, Will. Thank you. To move into the small group conversation. So now you have an opportunity to go. You're going to be randomly assigned to a group, and we're going to ask you to, react to any of what you heard the panelists or some of the questions. We are going to ask you to start off with, what does equity look and sound like on the Jamboard? And then give you a chance to have a discussion. We've got 30 minutes. And Christina, you have some instructions for us on this?
Yeah, so I just shared the Jamboard in the chat. So everyone, if you kindly please click on it, you should be taken to the Jamboard. And according to the breakout room that you'll be going to, I want to demonstrate it here. At the top of the room, it should give you the room number, and you'll be able to go to these arrows back and forth to find the breakout room number that you'll be in. The only warnings would be to avoid the clear frame. That will erase everything on the board. And you want to use this little sticky note feature here where you can add in your notes and save it, and it'll be on the board. To click out, you just click cancel, and then you can edit it here by double clicking, or you can delete it. So if everybody has a Jamboard open, it is in the chat, and I will be sending everyone to the breakout room. We have 30 minutes, and then we'll be coming back to the main room once we're done. Manny, any further instructions?
No, I think, again, please keep in mind, everyone, there are no simple solutions to this. So we're not going to complete everything, but please take advantage of this time to have a conversation on equity and among ourselves. So we'll be ready to go.
Okay, breakout rooms are opening. I believe so.
Okay. So here's what we're going to do. We have a few minutes here, and just like people